This is Nick Dutch again. We might as well call this the Psychic Experience Project video, following on from my last video. And I've received basically an essay via Facebook from some guy, okay, who I've known on YouTube for a long period of time, trustworthy source. And I'm just going to read out what he's written to me. I'm not mentioning his name. I'm choosing to edit out a few particular aspects of the story itself, and just to let you know what's going on here. If you want to contribute with your own personal psychic experiences you want me to relate together in another video, then you can use the comment section. If you've already got my Facebook, you can send a message to me on my Facebook as well if you want to. But either way, let's just crack on with this. Okay, here's my whole message. This is a guy who was having some emotional problems in 2012, and he was concerned about all kinds of things, but he was also starting to read the same book I've mentioned in a previous video, The Projection of the Astral Body by Muldoon and Carrington. It says here, he hadn't read enough of it for it to make an impression on him, but one afternoon, after weeks of bad sleep and really at an emotional rock bottom, he fell completely into torpor. Completely aware of his surroundings though. Okay, he says that, completely aware of my surroundings. I was confused about why I wasn't wearing my glasses. Then I noticed that my face was somehow in front of my face with the glasses on. Okay, so he was seeing his own face from the outside, looking back at himself. It wasn't exteriorization, but a sense of elongation, as if his consciousness or sense of perception was moved outside of his body so he could look back at himself. So he says there, I was in two places, but the same one place simultaneously. That was not my first experience. Let's go back in chronology. I had another projection experiences. Two were of the why is someone in my bed variety, with one difference, and that there was something that was in the corner of the room. On both occasions it was an inert or immobile, shadowy, for want of a better phrase, gnome thing. On the first occasion I found it somehow threatening. This was in an old house somewhere in the Swedish countryside. I had another similar experience. Hello again, gnome, he says. Except I could not see it, but rather sense it with a tactile intuitive perception, perhaps of the same species, but more distorted, is the phraseology he used. And he says that this one was not threatening. During mild, although not in terms of effect, consumption of cannabis, I'm able to see inside my body. It's like an MRI, and every time I'm showed how my right hemisphere is not working or is attuned to the left. I later had a brain scan, and it showed that, although undamaged, the two hemispheres did not work in concert as a neurotypical should. So, is that prophecy, or is that perception of what's inside the body? I know I've had some similar experiences, like with my digestive system, having experiences of things which is like a psychosomatic experience of my own body, coming through visual, as it were, hallucination or dream or that sort of thing. He then goes on to say, no brain damage. I had one more experience that I can class as astral, where I was flying across a large highway propelled by luminous energy. Well, he used a different word there, but I'm going to ignore that, okay? It might be and as it became more of a dream, I was able to lift cars with this same force. According to the news, no cars were mysteriously elevated, nor was the paintwork tainted. In the most recent is the most important. But before we start, I need to point out that no trace of any drug was in my system, and I never was a bit of a smoker. I sat on my bed in broad daylight, and in the moment I was taken to another place. Not experiencing of elevating, I found myself in the seat of a coach driving along the desert. The coach parked in a country courtyard within mountainous walls. Looking at the people, I assumed I was one of the many tourists, more than not spoke Dutch and German and belonged to that racial grouping. The majority were male, so the experience was of him seeming like he's a coach passenger and everyone else is speaking different languages. Some sort of educational training was taking place, excuse the fact that details are fuzzy, and I was guided by a disembodied voice. I believe I asked it why most of the tourists were male and who was organizing it. Aliens. It answered something that I couldn't understand. I don't remember exactly how it answered, but something along the lines of, you can't meet them. But in such a way as to suggest I wouldn't be able to see them if they were present. Namely, the apparent organizers of the apparent experience. At one point in the training, I was sent somewhere, the description of which will make all of this seem even more far-fetched. It was a realm with completely different physics. Everything was stretched upwards. I was on a conveyor, but when I changed my point of view, people were flat, and other paths were available. I could not walk in the normal sense. It was governed by whichever track I chose. I believe that at one point I returned to the ravine courtyard and the voice told me a little bit more about what the place was. It's a buffer, a foundation, or the cartilage, we could say, the bit before two train stations, but at the same time in both got there in the end. So almost as if this place that he had got to was some kind of like meeting place prior to going on to somewhere else spiritually or astrally. Okay, complex. When I was able to remember, it said something like it was a mistake or you were taken here too soon. Which sounds a bit like a near-death experience really, doesn't it? In a split second I was sat kneeling on my bed with a bloody great headache. I was able to record everything for a few minutes. All of my answers regarding green men or the lack thereof were answered then, dissolved. Maybe it was a flashback type trip, although I've never done acid. If what's happened was real, then why not just let me remember it and write a book? By the way, the brain scan I had wasn't for any psychological disorder. It was actually an autism test. And I wanted to find out if my juvenile dystopia diagnosis was still current. The diagnosis was atypical autism, which probably has no relation to my trip. So we got a series of experiences there. We got something which looks a bit like astral projection in terms of the conscious perception being outside of the body and then looking back on the body. Sylvain Muldoon spoke about the astral cable being able to extend and then perception coming out of the cable itself to a certain extent. So maybe that was something like the cable being projected out of the back of the head and he was looking back on himself that way. Hypothetically possible. As far as the story about the meeting the strange people in this ravine type courtyard place, that sounds to me as if it was like going into some sort of like in-between world prior to going on to the next one. There's a strong feeling of that to it, but it's not necessarily. But it might not necessarily be that. Okay. However, the astral projection type or psychic experiences of perceiving the entity in the corner of the room, that does seem to make some kind of sense because these things do seem to be out there somehow doing some things in whatever ways they do it. Why precisely that this guy saw a gnome or sensed it was a gnome and even saw another gnome at another point, presumably in another location, and it would be of the same species but slightly different. Alright, maybe it's an older one, maybe it's a younger one, whatever, it's difficult to say. Is very curious. Maybe that's the type of entity which this particular person is attractive to and has an affinity with. Or maybe that's the way in which that person perceives things through their own cultural filter. We don't know. Could it be an actual entity? Hypothetically, yeah. Do we know for sure? There's lots of things we don't know for sure. But as far as like these being weird experiences that seem to point to something, I would say, I'd give that an approval tick. Because there's some sense of another world, there's some sense of some similar experiences with what's described by Sylvain Muldoon and Hereward Carrington to a certain extent. And it's quite a curious selection of stories. Alright, so if you've got any other weird experiences of a psychic nature that you want to relate to me, whether it's about prophecy, precognition, whether it's about astral projection, whether it's about spiritual healing energy or whatever, then do let me know in the comment section. If you already have my Facebook, then send me a message there. and I look forward to speaking to you again about weird things at some point. Yeah, keep cool.